Hey, what's up? It's cute what if? This side. Today we will be seeing, what if Deku was stranded on an island? Now before we move ahead with the FIC, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. For future what ifs like this. Water, salt, and brine filled his mouth and clogged his nose. The briefest flash of the brilliant blue sky and the pristine island not too far off flashed across his eyes. Those early swimming lessons he took as a child, and even those rare times where they had peeing at the pool, were lost to his mind. Every twist was a desperate gasp for air as he writhed in the cool, yet warm water that he found himself in. His foot touched something sharp, sending a lance of pain through his body before he kicked down again and found something firm. And his body remembered how to swim. Izuku gasped for air the moment his head breached the surface, his legs kicking beneath him to keep his body afloat in the soft waves of the ocean he now found himself in. But he spun in the water, trying to find any hint of where he was just a moment ago. Where had he been? He couldn't remember. His memory was just blank, like the entire last few weeks or months of his life had been blurred into a boring gray sludge. Wait, wasn't there a voice just now? Or did he just think that? And why did he remember a smile? Confusion lasted for a few moments before panic set in. Mostly because something had brushed up against his foot. His hurt foot was currently creating a red cloud in the salty seawater. The island? He gasped again, twisting in the surprisingly still water as he looked for that brief hint of land he had seen just before splashing into the water. Why didn't he swim towards it the moment he saw it? He spotted the island and the green trees that nearly hugged the shore. It was small enough that it wouldn't even be a dot on a map, but large enough that it had to have something on there for him. At best it would be a person, someone with a boat, or even answers. At the very least, he hoped there would be food and shelter for him. He couldn't quite tell the distance, but it was going to be the furthest he'd ever had to swim in his life. Izuku pushed forward, ignoring the pain in his left foot as he did so. The fact that he was bleeding wasn't a good thing, but the fact that he was bleeding in the ocean was probably worse. Panic began to set in as he ran through the very likely scenario that he could end up losing his foot, if not his life. What would he need to treat it if it was bad? How would he treat it if it was bad? He was still in middle school. Pain throbbed in his head. Was there a reason why he couldn't remember anything? He drew close to the shore and finally managed to look down at the light blue ocean he found himself in. It was shallow and teeming with fish, some of which were brave enough to swim towards him and his trail of BLD, while many more darted away from him. It would have been shallow enough to stand, but he knew that coral was sharp and dangerous to stand on. It was probably what he had cut himself on earlier. The water grew shallower as he approached the island, far faster than it should with how far away it looked. Soon enough, he found himself more crawling than actually swimming, and he placed a few careful steps onto the beach. The warm sun just overhead felt great, with the air being crisp and fresh, far fresher than he had ever gotten in the middle of Japan. It felt like he had been flung into one of those vacation brochures. Only there was no resort. Izuku looked towards the island he had been swimming towards, and then at the shallow sand bar he had stumbled across. A large lagoon separated him from that main island, its waters so clear he could see the sea life that made the shallow waters their home. If he learned to fish, he'd probably never go hungry. But more importantly, Izuku followed down onto the sandy beach and took in a deep breath, before he let it all out in a whiny tantrum. What the hell? Where am I? Why am I here? How did I get here? Why me? What happened? Where is anybody? Why don't I have shoes on? Why am I just in a t-shirt and sweats? Izuku slammed his hand against the rough white sand and glared up at a cloud. And why can't I remember what I was doing before? His ranting, crying, and just in general feeling sorry for himself was brought to an abrupt end when he heard, or perhaps felt, something rising out of the water. He turned his head and wished that the sand would swallow him whole. Massive would be an understatement to the sheer size of this serpentine creature that rose up from the sea, taller than any skyscraper Izuku had ever seen. Its multicolored scales were in a rainbow pattern that extended well below the ocean waves. Less than a moment later, a second creature rose from the depths to challenge it, and it looked like a massive worm-like poodle with a seagull beak. Each one of the two creatures that could use Tokyo Tower as a toothpick glared at each other before they charged, Izuku seeing their massive clash well before he heard it. His instincts shut down, and his brain stopped working, which ultimately might have been the best choice he could have made as he lay perfectly flat on that lone sandbar watching two titans clash in some kind of dispute. By the time the creatures submerged themselves once more into the ocean, his shirt and pants had long since dried, and the bleeding from his foot had stopped. The island, Izuku muttered as he crawled on his belly, unwilling to make himself even the slightest bit noticeable lest the creatures turn out to be the man-eating kind. Though really they looked like entire ships and buildings were on the menu. The water was calm, almost eerily calm, as there was no wave that ever went over a foot in height, and the complete lack of wind made him think that any waves generated here were due to those two behemoths. Because of this, the swimming was easy and oddly calming as he took in a brief moment to appreciate the natural beauty he was surrounded by. Though with those things around, it was very likely that he was going to be surrounded by this stuff until the day he died. Best not to think about that. He could panic and cry after he made sure he wasn't going to die. When he got to the beach, Izuku took a few steps onto the white sands and collapsed, feeling moderately safe in his new tropical home. He grabbed his foot and finally inspected the wound he had gotten upon first arriving. The cut was shallow on the soft part of his foot and just to the side. If I'm careful with where I step, I should be okay. It'd be nice to have some shoes though. He recalled watching movies where someone would tear off a part of their clothing to wrap a wound. It was worth a shot. He reached for his sleeve and pulled, but the wet fabric was too tough. As he looked at it more closely, he realized that tearing off his sleeve would be pretty pointless, as it wasn't long enough to be wrapped around his foot and was too loose to stay on its own. He flopped onto his back and stared up at the still leaves that gave him an ounce of shade. What am I going to do? The sun had moved from directly overhead to having 1/3 of its arc left. Fresh water. Food. Shelter. He needed to find those things as soon as he could. With a groan, he sat back up, his stomach grumbling at the idea of food. He must not have eaten before he showed up here. He stared at his bare feet and then at the green island behind him. The vegetation wasn't terribly thick, he could easily walk between the trees without much worry. It was probably smarter to protect his feet than the rest of him. Pulling out his drawstring and tearing the ends of his sleeves using his teeth, he fashioned a pair of shoes out of his shirt and pants and kept his feet wrapped. Honestly, I have no idea if this is a good idea. With his makeshift shoes haphazardly tied to his feet as best as he could manage, he started to walk around the outside of the island, hoping to chance onto something like a creek, or better yet, people. Just as the sun was starting to set and Izuku was about to lose hope, Izuku caught a glimpse of his salvation. A ship ran ashore. Or at least half of one. Its hull was sun-damaged, but he could make out the word Mar written on the hull with a white paint. The front half of the ship had been completely removed, probably by one of those giant creatures Izuku saw earlier, and the mast was completely destroyed. The ship gave him hope, a lot of hope. It meant that he had a place to live. There might even be food. And water. But most of all it meant that there were people. Sure, the ship being made mostly of wood was odd, but that didn't really mean anything. He was willing to accept that wherever he wasn't anywhere near Japan. Hello. He called, his voice dry from a lack of fresh water, but he forced it through, hoping that there was actually someone to say hello back. No one did, save for a bird flying away. He walked over to where the front of the ship was at its lowest and climbed up. The slight tilt was annoying, but it meant that any water that came in would eventually just roll down towards the ocean. Pardon the intrusion. He took a few steps into the ship and carefully looked at several of the crates that hid in the shadows. Some were smashed, their stores of cannonball, bullets, and black powder scattered, and one container was even filled with shattered glass. He made his way towards a door that was partially fused shut due to disuse. When it didn't budge, he rammed his shoulder into it. The door flung open, and Izuku tumbled forward, the setting sun illuminating the interior of the ship well enough that he could see. He landed on something that crunched and broke under his weight. It was probably hunger, but the bony corpse Izuku had just crashed into did not spark fear in him even as he stared at the skull of someone that had been dead long enough that their skin had vanished, leaving only white bones and yellow teeth. Instead, he took it as a sign for his likelihood to survive this place. Though, from the looks of their ship, they could have been dead before they got to the island. Pushing himself off the ground, Izuku found several more skeletons littering the room, many of them wearing the same white and blue shirt with the word Marine printed onto the back. Rifles were spilled out onto the ground, and there were several lockers placed around the large room. It looked like a barracks. Am I desperate enough to wear dead people's clothing? After a moment of contemplation, Izuku found himself wearing the ancient shirts, pants, socks and shoes that he managed to find in an open locker. The shoes didn't exactly fit, but they were probably better than nothing. He searched the rest of the ship quickly after that, navigating room to room and eventually making his way to what was probably the captain's quarters. There were dozens of books and scrolls scattered across the walls and at least a dozen skeletons piled on top of one another. Something caught his eye though. Clutched in the hands of one of the skeletons, one wearing a fancy white coat that made him look that extra bit official, was a large green fruit. The patterns on the fruit almost made it look like it was some kind of art, or like those fake fruit Katsuki's mom put on the table. His stomach growled at the first sight of food Izuku had seen all day. Well, besides the fish. He moved forward carefully. It couldn't be real, right? And even if it was, it had to be spoiled, right? Everyone else was long dead, but this fruit, this strange green fruit with a pattern like clouds dancing around it in a swirl, was perfectly fine. He grabbed the fruit from the dead captain and tapped on it like he'd seen his mother do at the store. He had no idea if it sounded ripe or not, but it didn't sound or smell spoiled. His mouth watered. His stomach growled. He took a bite. It didn't taste rotten. But it didn't taste good either. It was like a mixture of every single vegetable he hated to eat mixed with over-salted ramen, and that time he had made the mistake of sniffing his gym clothes. But it was food. Bite by painful bite, he munched on the foul-tasting fruit, his stomach settling despite the foulness. Before long, the fruit was entirely gone, and he felt full. Izuku placed a hand on his stomach and smiled. He had found some food. He found a place to sleep. And now, all he needed to was Izuku let out a giant sneeze that shook his entire body. He landed on his butt and stared at the dust storm that had been kicked up from his sneeze. Was this the fruit? What happened? Why was his sneeze so... He let out another sneeze and slid back along the floor until he hit the wall. Were his sneezes always so powerful? He stumbled up onto his feet and darted out of the room, desperate to get out of the dust before he somehow destroyed the ship even more. He stumbled out onto the main deck, the slant slightly more amplified as the sun finally began to set, revealing a sky full of stars. Shoo! He let out a massive sneeze that sent him flying into the wall once more, scaring the CRP out of every single bird on the island. The ship creaked under the power of his sneeze. Was this his quirk? After years of being quirkless, his quirk shows up and it's freaking superpowered sneezes. Just great. A tear slid down his cheek as Izuku slammed the final cross down into the ground. The upturned jungle dirt was soft and moist, making digging as messy as it was easy. There was no reason for him to be sad. He never knew these people. These Marines. Not only did the ship's manifesto tell him as much, but many of them had a name tag somewhere on their uniform. But he was. Izuku stood and placed the captain's large tricorn hat. Its once proud whites and blues now dyed a sad gray from the ravages of time, though it still held its shape. He placed a hand over his issy and lowered his head. Vice Admiral Luna D. Pearl, I feel bad that your misfortune turned into my fortune. I hope you can rest easy now that you're buried with your crew. He held the pose for a moment before he turned and stared out at the early morning ocean. In Japan there would often be fog coming and going in the early morning, but here, it was as though every day was a clear June day with only the mildest of summer showers to worry about. Though the storm still came out of nowhere. Izuku had watched the ocean for far too long to not have noticed any clouds coming towards his island prison. It was like the summer storms would just happen randomly here on this island, and then vanish, leaving not a mark on the tranquil blue sea that consumed every single horizon. He needed to escape. He needed to see living people again. He wanted to go home. But that was impossible. He had seen the maps of this world. He had at first struggled to read the language until something clicked. and he was able to put together that it was some strange combination of English and Japanese that somehow worked. And the more he did, the more he started to accept that this world wasn't Earth. It might be a fact, but that didn't mean he had to be happy about it. From what he had gathered, based on several reports, maps, and a field guide, he was in what they called the Calm Belt. A dangerous place filled with giant sea monsters, check. With little to no wind or waves, check. And practically divided the world in two. Technically it was 4 thanks to the Red Line, a massive continent that circled the globe. His 3rd grade Earth Science class said that this world shouldn't exist. Then again, science also said that quirks shouldn't exist, but everyone in his old world had quirks, so really, science didn't know a lot of things. There was another thing that science got wrong. Izuku stepped out onto the lonesome sandy beach that he spent most of his days on and stretched slowly. There were few things for him to do on this island: forage for food, retrieve water from the spring in the middle of the island, read what few things weren't completely ravaged by time, bury the dead, plot his escape, and practice his quirk. Okay, Izuku hummed to himself and bounced on the ball of his feet, feeling the air around him. So, it's a bit more than a few. But I have plenty of food, the water tank is full, and I'm all out of dead bodies to bury. He paused and smiled to himself, the month or so of complete isolation clearly having no effect on his mental well-being. I probably shouldn't have said that last part so chipper. He held his hand out and felt the wind swirl around it, faster and faster, until he could feel the air shaking around him from how strong the gust was in that one area. Besides, he muttered, turning towards the sea. Training my quirk is part of my escape plan. He formed a fist and pulled his arm back. His toes dug into the sand while he glared out towards the endless blue, and then he took in a deep breath that calmed his nerves and made his entire body steady. Before he lost concentration on his wind, he pulled back just a bit more and then threw the ball of wind out towards the sea. A mighty gust exploded from the palm of his hand, sending a great deal of sand and water up into the air. Several channels that he had dug previously appeared in the shallow shores only to be swallowed up from this new and improved swirling gust. Science had told him that he was quirkless. Izuku smiled at his hand for a moment. He still felt so giddy using his quirk, he wanted to get better and better at using it. Science was wrong. From what he understood of his quirk, he could create and control wind, which, given how he was stuck in the middle of an island that was stuck in the middle of an sea where sea travel was nearly impossible because of its lack of wind, seemed like it was really lucky. Ideally, he'd stay on this island long enough for him to learn how to control his winds to the point that he could fly, something he already attempted and regretted as he nearly drowned in the sea shallows shortly after. But I might not be sane enough for when that happens. Izuku flapped his arms and looked around at the endless sea, desperate to spot a ship of any kind that just so happened to be passing through. From what he understood and even observed in his makeshift home, the Marines had made boats that could travel the calm belts. Or maybe his home was an experimental vessel that failed and now they just didn't bother since the giant monsters were an issue. A big issue. While there were days where Izuku had gone without seeing a single cloud, and he had seen absolutely 0 ships passing along the horizon, seeing those gigantic sea kings was a daily occurrence. They'd stick their heads out of the water, thrash about, or even just swim casually by like it was no big deal. The current plan was to make a raft and use his quirk to sail out of the calm belt. There were several problems with this though. 1. He had no idea where to go. 2. He had no idea how to sail besides wind make boat go. 3. He had no idea how to build a boat. 4. Giant sea monsters. But it's not like anyone is going to come looking for me. He scratched the back of his head and began to play, train with his quirk, navigating the wind around his body and then throwing it out to sea, or using it to knock a few ripe coconuts out of their trees. He was still trying to figure out how exactly he was going to get off this island. He wanted cooked food. Good cooked food. A bath. A bed that didn't have sand in it. A conversation with someone. I want to make friends. He shouted and let out a torrent of wind from his entire body. The ocean and sand mixed to create a frothing flurry that extended well beyond the shallows and into the sea. The water collapsed back in on itself, creating new waves that would quickly vanish under the calm belt's pressure. Only the waves didn't stop. They grew. They grew a lot. A sea king, one of the biggest Izuku ever seen with black and white scales, appeared out of the water. Izuku scrambled back into the treeline as the tidal wave of this creature emerging from the ocean threatened to swallow him and drag him out to sea. And if recent experience was any indication, that would be his death. He grabbed onto a tree and quickly climbed up into its thick leafy branches that cut at his exposed skin. What was it doing so close? Why was it here? Was it because of his wind? The entire island rumbled as the beast moved over it, its massive shadow blocking out all light from the sun as it did a clean sweep over the island. Then came the noise. A low rumble that Izuku felt as much as heard, followed by a powerful headache that nearly had him letting go of his tree-shaped refuge. The rumbling was louder than anything he had ever heard, like the earth was waking up from a long nap. But the message was clear. The Sea King was aware of someone making wind. Izuku saw a second shadow appear in the sky. It was not a second Sea King, thankfully, but instead it was the black and white one's massive tail that it slammed down onto the island with earth-shattering force. He didn't even have to guess what the creature was aiming for. His beachside home was likely completely destroyed. He held onto that tree for what felt like hours. Even as his stomach growled, he wouldn't budge until the Sea King stopped moving. It took until nightfall for that to happen. And by then, illuminated by the bright moon on a cloudless night, Izuku saw his doom. The Sea King had entirely encircled the island with its massive body as it snored lightly. He needed to get off this island. Marineford, get yelled at for being late, dump off half of his rookies, then sail towards Dawn Island to get new recruits and see if his stubborn grandson finally wanted to be a Marine. Ace too, but it might be for the best if Ace stayed as far away from Marines as possible. Garp scoffed and spat off the figurehead of his ship. The massive loogie splashed in the tranquil waters of the calm belt. He then began to pick his nose with his pinky while glaring forward. Probably not, since both those brats have pirates on their brains. The downside of having a group of mountain bandits raise them, and that DMN red hair shanks, but at the end of the day they would be stronger for their upbringing. He scoffed and flicked a booger out into the sea with enough force to make a splash. Still, I'd rather have them as strong pirates than weak Marines. Vice Admiral Garp. A youthful female voice coming from behind him startled him out his thoughts, and he turned his head just enough to see one of the more promising youths he had recruited standing with a nearly perfect salute. Isuka, a textbook definition of a tomboy that was raised by an army of older brothers, was one of the few recruits that Garp would be keeping for that little extra bit of guidance to reach her full potential. Her bright red hair made her stand out from the rest of his crew. That, and she used a rapier for some reason. "What is it?" he asked, turning to face the sea again. "Probably some other boring report. I came to report that we've entered the calm belt and are using the—" He raised his hand to stop her. Not because he was annoyed by her report. Well, he was. The Marines sure did love their boring reports, but every officer worth their salt would know when their ship had entered the calm belt. The clear skies, the lack of waves and the general stillness of everything, and the lack of wind in the sails. But there was wind. He felt a small gust, tickling his mustache coming from inside the calm belt. Garp stuck his finger in his mouth and held it up into the air. Another gust. A smile spread across his face as he hopped back from his usual sitting spot and headed towards the helm. Something interesting was out there. "Sir?" Isuka asked, following after him. "Is something wrong? What do you know about the calm belt, rookie?" He barked with laughter, his gaze set on the helm. "It's infested with Sea King, there's no waves and—" He started to climb up the stairs. A stronger gust than the first two, coming from the same direction, blew across his deck, causing the sails to waver. Isuka stopped, her short red hair blowing right in her stupefied face. "No wind." "Wah." Garp let out a laugh and hurried up the stairs. He needed to turn the ship before he lost his heading. "Sir, don't you see Isuka?" he bellowed, shoving the poor cadet off the wheel and stuck his finger in the air, waiting for another gust of wind. As if on cue, the wind caught his finger and he turned his ship towards it. "There's something out there. Something interesting." He could feel it in his gut, that whatever was out there would be worth the detour. Besides, he was already late. What harm was there in being extra late? Scraps. Wreckage. A wink of sleep. An impossible plan. and a ray of hope. Perhaps he had become a bit too comfortable on the island thanks to his now destroyed home and he was being punished for it, or maybe it was all the practicing he did with his quirk, but the giant wall that he had always felt in front of him was now trying to kill him. Before, it was his own quirklessness, then when he discovered his quirk and the ability to control wind, it was a vast sea and no direction, and now that wall had teeth and took the shape of a monstrous sea serpent that could swallow a city. He called it Zebra. Izuku held his breath for just a few moments as he watched the sun rise over Zebra's scaled body. The early morning light played tricks with the shadows, creating bubbles of light that illuminated the shallow lagoon. It felt like the moment he got over Zebra's body that he'd be safe, that there'd be an island of people to save him. But there was only an empty sea beyond that wall. Still, Zebra had destroyed half the island last night in a few short hours. His home was gone, his stores of food were gone, and even his source of water had been destroyed. Even if Zebra didn't resume his destruction when he woke up, he'd likely die of starvation and thirst before long. But he had a feeling that Zebra was after him. He was why there was wind in the windless sea after all. It was just something that he felt, like he had somehow made an enemy of the enormous creature. And right now the only way he had to fight was to run. Still, his plan was less than ideal. He couldn't touch the sea without having his energy drained, he knew that much, and there was no way that he could just fly all the way to the next island. Thankfully, he had his time on Earth to use as experience. The idea was simple, a bit like a boat, but for just one person. Back home, they called it kitesurfing. He double-checked everything as much as he could. His feet were strapped to the bottom of his former home. From what he read, there was something about the material that would stop other sea kings from attacking him. His feet were stuck in a pair of boots that he had nailed to the large flat board and then tied over and over again so as to not let go no matter what happened. The longest rope he could find was wrapped around his waist, his ist, and all the way around his arms until he gripped it tight in each hand, and extended about 5 meters away from him was the largest amount of sail he could salvage that didn't have holes. He had only seen someone use one of these once. It was at the beach with his family, and he remembered watching the person flip in the air and then come crashing down strong into the water. Right then, he whispered, and whipped the ropes out in front of him, causing his kite sail thing to float up in the air for a moment. He hit it with his wind, a small stream coming from his body which instantly got caught. He increased the pressure, focusing on it, feeling how the sail pulled at him with every slight alteration. Time to do or He turned his body, hopping on the sandy beach, and aimed his kite out towards the sea and Zebra's body. The moment he pointed his wind towards the massive serpent, it began to move, and so did Izuku. He set his wind to full, his makeshift sail catching it and then pulling him along. His board cut across the water, sending a wave of clear water behind him. The fastest he had ever gone outside of a vehicle was when he had been pushed down a really steep hill on a bike with Kaken. His board was already at least twice that fast. Zebra's massive body coiled as he approached, but he was already on a collision course for it. If he didn't act now, he'd crash and then it would be game over. Something happened. A basic instinct. A will to survive. Something. He jumped on the water, pulling his board up off the water while pushing his wind harder into his sail, the ropes cutting into his arms as he held on for dear life. For that brief moment as he jumped over the largest creature he had ever seen, Izuku felt no fear, his heart pounding from pure excitement. A smile formed on his face and stuck even as his board slammed down onto the placid ocean and the fear returned. In part because Zebra had fully woken up. He pushed towards the side, barely avoiding a quick tail snap from Zebra that could easily sink a ship, and the wave itself seemed to chase after Izuku with intent to drown him beneath it. But he was faster. He pushed his wind harder, and focused on that faraway horizon, hoping to find anything that wasn't the empty blue or a massive sea king that wanted him dead. A roar that shook the sky and sea echoed from behind him as Zebra began to pursue after him, the sound of its massive body swimming through the water pushing Izuku further. He let more wind out, feeling the rope dig into his skin from the sheer amount of tension he was playing under it. He needed to be careful. If anything at all, broke, he would be dead. Zebra splashed down behind him, close enough that Izuku could feel droplets of water smack his back. Then again as Zebra emerged from the water. He had hoped that a creature of Zebra's massive size would be slow and cumbersome, but the creature simply defied logic and swam through the ocean with all the agility of a dolphin. The term king felt really fitting for this. Again and again Zebra came crashing down next to Izuku, each time feeling closer than the last as Izuku began to feel the fatigue of his escape. His hands were white, his arms were red, and he could barely feel his legs anymore. This was it. This was how he was going to die. Lunch for Zebra. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling Zebra crash down behind him one last time. And then opened his eyes wide as he spotted something. Something that wasn't just ocean and sky. White sails. A blue hull. A ship. A marine ship. He was safe. He stopped and glanced behind him for a moment. He was leading their death right towards them. Damn it. What was he thinking? There was no way that a ship that size could beat Zebra. He'd have to lead Zebra away from them. Somehow lose him and then find that ship again. He turned sharply, his board catching air as he followed after his kite. And that was when his heart truly sank. Emerging from the water was a reminder that Zebra was not the only king of the sea. The one he had seen clashing against Zebra when he first arrived emerged from the water, its large chicken-like beak piercing through the water while its poodle-like fluff did little to slow it down. Zebra crashed down behind Izuku far too close this time. His board snapped and he was sent high into the air, tumbling over himself as he tried to hold onto his kite and hold himself above the sea. He is not the enemy. Izuku gasped and felt hope rush into him again as he saw the pink poodle chicken crash into Zebra's massive form, knocking his opponent to the side. Perfect. By some miracle, he righted himself and searched for that ship again. He spotted it. They were sailing right towards him again. Were they there to rescue him? Was a chance? Did they see him? A dozen thoughts rushed through Izuku's mind as he stared at his salvation for a few moments. He glided down, holding his kite above his head like a small parachute. Relief and exhaustion washed over him in equal amounts as he saw the crew of that ship scrambling to catch him. He swung wide trying to avoid the sails of the ship and came crashing down towards the ship. It would hurt, but then a tall man wearing a suit and a fedora caught him, his marine coat flying off as they tumbled onto the ship. Garp, the man shouted, "I caught him. Great work, Bogard. Get his wounds tended to." A gruff voice that captivated Izuku echoed across the ship as Izuku found himself glancing at the source. A tall gray-haired man stood with his back towards him, his marine coat floating in the wind. The world slowly began to fade to black for Izuku as he felt the ropes around his arms lessen and the fatigue began to set in. His arms burned, his legs felt like jello, and his heart felt like it might explode. But he still found himself smiling. Right up until he saw Zebra rise out of the water right in front of the man called Garp. Then the world went black. Wake up. Wah. Wah. That's the spirit. Izuku sat up in the cot he had been placed in, his heart racing as he adjusted to the dim light of surroundings. The first thing he noticed was the swaying of the ship, a gentle rocking that messed with his senses and made everything appear to be slightly tilted to one side or the other. The second was much more concerning. Separating him from the rest of the ship was a set of large iron bars. Beyond those bars sat that man, the one that had been called Garp. His arms were crossed, and he stood at his full height, which absolutely dwarfed any person Izuku had ever seen before. The wide smile on Garp's face exuded confidence that put Izuku at ease. "Welcome aboard, boy." Garp let out a groan and rolled his shoulders before sitting down on a bench that was too small for him, causing his knees to nearly reach his shoulders as he Saturday. "Had a feeling you'd wake up if I told you to." Izuku swallowed, his mouth going a bit dry before he could really speak. "Thank you, sir." "Wah. It was worth the price for admission. I had a feeling that if I followed that wind I'd find something interesting, but the spectacle of you avoiding that Sea King was quite the sight." Garp slapped his knees and then tapped on his chin. "We'll have to work on your landing though." Nier took Bogart out. "How long have you had your devil fruit power?" "Devil fruit?" Izuku asked, staring at Garp confused. "Was that what they called quirks?" "Large fruit, doesn't look like anything you've ever seen before, apparently tastes terrible, and after eating it you get some strange power." Garp stuck his finger up his nose and started to pick at it with a dull expression on his face. How'd you not know that, kid? His quirk wasn't actually his quirk. It really shouldn't matter, but, for some reason it did. Oh well, I don't really remember much. It was true, it felt like he still had a chunk of his life missing. I kind of woke up splashing down into the ocean near an island, and I found a crashed marine ship. And there was a strange fruit in there. Amnesia. Garp hummed and hawed at that as he thought to himself. Well then, lad, do you remember your name? Izuku nodded. Izuku Midoriya. That's a weird name, but then again I'm half a letter away from Garp. Wah. Garp let out another laugh and then pushed his thumb into his own I'm Vice Admiral Monkey D. Garp. Izuku nodded deeply. Thank you for saving my life, sir. You already did that. Thanking someone too much will make people think you're kissing butt or something. Garp started to pick his nose again, and then looked at his finger and flicked it off in a random direction. Was this how marine captains normally were? Now the question is, what are we going to do with you? Sir. Garp's smile vanished and he finally leveled a serious look at Izuku. If you want me to dump you off at some port, I can do that. You can probably live a decent life as a farmer or merchant. Might be a bit boring, I'd reckon, and then you also have a devil fruit power as well. Garp's eyes turned sharp like he was cutting through all the layers of Izuku's being until he found the core. No, with a power like yours, you only have two options. You can join the Marines and go far with that, if you survive long enough. Izuku swallowed. He already knew that this world was harsher than Earth, in large part due to those giant sea kings. And the second option? You can become a pirate? Garp laughed and slapped his knee. And what a pirate you'd be. Wah! Controlling the wind like you do. There'd be no catching you. A pirate? Izuku stood in his cell and was quickly greeted by his stomach rumbling and reminding him he hadn't eaten in a while. What's more was the itchy soreness that covered most of his body as his entire torso was covered in bandages. Some were even stained a light red along his arms. It was especially bright where the rope had dug into his skin. Garp nodded and huffed. It all depends on what you want to do. What you can put up with and what you can't. If your sense of justice is great, go for the Marines. If you don't like being told what to do and you've got a thirst for freedom, go for pirates. But, Izuku scrunched his face up and tilted his head to the side as he tried to wrap his head around what Garp was saying. Aren't pirates bad guys? Garp shrugged and stood to his full height. Most of them, but the world isn't so black and white. Izuku swallowed as he stared up at the man that was nearly twice his height. But the question is, Izuku, what do you want in this world? The answer was obvious. He stared at his hand, the loose bandage spinning around as he created a miniature twister in his hand and began to feel his heartbeat in anticipation. He didn't know much about this world, but still, if there were people, there were going to be those that needed help. I want to be a hero. A hero? Garp placed both hands on his hips and let out a laugh that shook the whole ship. Wah. 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 What makes you say that, boy? Izuku felt his cheeks burn. It was the same as in middle school. Whenever he said he wanted to be a hero, everyone would always laugh. But it was different this time. This time he had a power. He swallowed. I want to save people. I want to save as many people as I can with a smile on my face. Garp's laughter came to a cold stop, but his smile grew. And grew. And grew. And then the laughter came boiling up once more. This time the whole ship really did shake. I like your definition of hero a whole lot more, Izuku. Garp clapped his hands and let out a massive cheer. All right then, it's settled. I want you to become a Marine. And I'll help you become a hero that can save everyone with a smile on their face. Yes, sir. Izuku gave a fake salute, his smile practically bubbling over with excitement. But you have to stay in that cell. Garp tapped on the door, revealing that it had been unlocked the whole time. I'm all out of bunks until we get to Marineford. Izuku looked around at his apparently new room and shrugged. Well, it won't be forever. That's the spirit. Oh, and Garp-sensei. Wah. I guess that works. Wah. Garp wiped a tear from his eye and smiled at him eagerly. What is it? What happened to Zebra, that giant sea king that was chasing me? Oh, I punched it and sent it packing. He shouldn't bother you again for a while. He punched a sea king. What? There were, in fact, normal-sized people in this world. Not everyone was Garp's size, and the second tallest was Bogard, his right-hand man who was still well over 8 feet tall, so at least he didn't have to worry about spending his time here being significantly shorter than everyone else. Though that might still be the case, given the size of the desk in front of him. All right, Bogard hummed as he looked over the form that Izuku had filled out. It was his application to join the Marines, something that right now just felt like the right choice. After all, they were the good guys, preventing pirates and sea bandits from just causing chaos. Almost everything looks like it's in order, but we're going to have to do better than Combelt for your origin. Bogard sighed and pinched his nose before looking at Izuku. You really don't remember anything at all? Izuku felt his sweat falling down the back of his neck. He'd never been interviewed by someone before. It was nerve-wracking, even if he was pretty sure they were going to recruit him anyway. Mostly because Garp said so. He glanced towards Garp, who was standing with his hands behind his back, looking out the large windows that looked out at sea. No, I really don't remember how I ended up on that island. Talking about Japan non-stop probably wouldn't help his case. I just woke up in the middle of the calm belt near the island where I found that crashed ship and that devil fruit. Bogard slapped the form on the desk and glanced at it again. Bah? Garp gave a huff. Just put found at sea. If those DMN bureaucrats have a problem with it, they can shove it up their tightly clenched buttocks. Besides, it's not like we don't have weirder recruitments. We do, others don't. Bogard gave a sigh but ultimately started to scribble down on Izuku's forearm again. With his pen still on the paper, Bogard raised an eye towards Izuku. I don't suppose you have a favored weapon or any training with one. Before Izuku could even open his mouth, Garp turned, finger halfway up his nose like always. The man had to be a booger factory. What part about no memories don't you understand? Besides, he's got a blasted wind fruit. Just put a blank. He can figure out what weapon he likes later. I forget, is he filling this out or are you? You're the one with the pen in your hand. Izuku could all but see Bogard's soul leave his body. These two had to be brothers or something. Fine, we'll leave it blank. Bogard tapped his foot in annoyance, before he pushed the pen and paper over towards Izuku. Now then, there's one last thing we're going to need from you. The pen was pointed at one of the few spaces Izuku had left blank. His middle initial. He stared at it for a moment while taking Bogard's pen. The giant of a man's hand was nearly twice Izuku's own size, yet the pen still fit comfortably in his hand. He knew that many countries had middle names, but in Japan, they simply didn't. I don't have a middle name though. I'm Izuku Midoriya. Can't leave it blank? Bogard tapped on the spot. Izuku looked towards Garp, who had stopped picking his nose. Just put whatever feels natural to you. Doesn't have to even be a real name, just a letter will do for now. Garp shrugged and then crossed his arms, a deep scowl forming on his face. Annoying enough, that's not something we can leave blank. Izuku stared at the single space reserved for a letter. Was a middle name that important? Both Garp and Bogard were acting like it was somehow more important than his actual name. But it was just part of his name, right? Izuku placed the pen on the paper and thought for a moment. What felt right? For All Might, for All Might. E for Endeavor. There were so many amazing heroes that he could possibly choose from, but what felt right? Deej, the wind on the back of his neck tickled and he could all but hear it whisper something to him. Hadn't he heard this voice before? Why D? D is for Deku. A bitter memory of his school days flashed over him as he thought about the letter D. It was one of the first they learned in English studies. He even got a shirt that had a giant red D on it at one point. Deej, the wind whispered to him again, like it was promising greatness. Was it the wind? Garp swiped the paper away from Izuku before he could even register that he had written the letter onto the paper. He slapped the document like it was a newborn and nodded to himself. What made you choose that? Izuku wiggled in his seat and scratched the back of his head. I don't really know. I mean, it was the middle initial of the captain of that ship I found. What? Out of all the initials? Bogard leaned back in his chair and groaned, hand falling on top of his head as he pushed his fedora back to the point it fell on the floor behind him. You just had to, Bwah. Garp started a deep belly laugh as he slammed the paper down onto the desk. Gwah, gwah, gwah. It fits. That's amazing. Bah. It felt like Garp's laugh was shaking the entire ship. What on earth are you laughing about? Bogard stumbled out of his chair and stared Garp right in the eyes. You're not making any DMN sense? Don't you see? Bah. He's eaten a wind devil fruit. And he's got a D-bois. Garp moved over and pulled Izuku into a hug, lifting him off the ground and stubbing him about. If you aren't a Stormbringer, I don't know what else is. Wow. Izuku was too busy being tossed around like a rag doll to really process what any of that meant. Garp. Bogard shouted and slapped his hand on the desk strong, ending the man's revelry for a brief moment. This is serious. He's AD and he has no past. Bogard sighed and ran his hand through his short salt and pepper hair before he pointed at Izuku with a frown. You should know what that means. Garp stopped and let Izuku to the ground before he sighed. It means they're going to be watching him like a hawk. Garp patted Izuku on the shoulders before leaning down and looking him in the eyes. At least until he earns their trust. Easier said than done. Bogard scratched the back of his head. You should know that. I'm confused. Izuku finally managed to speak. Why is D such a big deal? It's just an initial right. Well yes, but mostly no. Bogard examined the forum again and scooped it off the table. The thing is, many people believe that those that bear the will of D are the enemy of God, and that they will bring about a storm that will shake the world. Can I change it? Izuku asked, reaching for the paper. I can pick A, or M, or H, there's so many other letters. Didn't someone say he wasn't the enemy? When was that said? Why did it feel like he was hearing things? His head pounded with sudden pain. We can, Bogard said firmly with a nod. But it really won't change the fact that you are now Izuku de Midoriya? Was it wrong he thought that sounded cool? But wait, wasn't Pearl de Lune D? And she was a Marine. Izuku flailed his arms. Wah. Garp let out a laugh and patted Izuku on his back. Don't worry too much about it, my boy. You can still be a Marine, and you'll be one hell of a Marine too. Really? Of course. Garp smiled. After all, I'm Monkey D. Garp? That filled him with a sense of relief he hadn't seen coming. Really, this whole middle initial had been far more stressful than being on that island. The island was still worse. Better than being chased by a sea king. But kitesurfing was pretty awesome. Garp. Bogard reached into a drawer and pulled out another form. Forgive me for suggesting this, but since Izuku has no past or family, it might make things easier if you were to. Bogard handed the stack of papers to Garp, who took them with an angry huff. At least this one wants to join the Marines. Wah! Garp bellowed and looked at the papers before slugging Bogard in the shoulder strong. Bogard, you duplicitous BSTRD. That's a great idea. What is? Izuku asked, trying to get any hint of information from the papers. Bogard looked down at him and smiled. The brass would probably be more accepting of you if Garp adopted you. Wouldn't be the first time I took in a stray. Garp laughed. So what do you say, Izuku, wanna be a monkey? But you barely know me. I know you've got a good heart, and that's enough. Logically, it would make sense to have some kind of a family in this world, and Garp seemed really nice, though a bit on the gross side. If you think it'll help, then it's settled. As of today, you are Monkey D. Izuku. He still had no idea what the hell the D meant though. But apparently he was one. He missed his island. Becoming a Marine meant first becoming a Marine recruit, which meant that his day was spent doing two things: cleaning every single inch of the ship and learning everything there was to learn about sailing. And because he was late to the class and the newest recruit, he had to race to catch up to the other ones. Twice already he had gotten stuck during rigging drills, and several of his fingers had been crushed during cannon drills, all while his arms were still covered in bandages from his rope burns. And the food wasn't great either. Still, he had something to look forward to. Once they arrived at a port, he'd be given shore leave, and then he was going to do two very important things: find the best food he could buy, and take a nice long bath. Izuku slumped on his mop and glanced out of the portside window for a moment. Apparently today was the day that they were going to be leaving the comm belt, which meant that the rigging drills were going to become less practice and more real as they were subjected to the new conditions, such as actual weather, like wind and rain. There might even be night drills. We don't get a break yet, flyboy? His mop was whacked by one of his fellow recruits. Isuka was a fresh recruit just like him, but she appeared to have a great deal of experience and knowledge about the Marines compared to him, so the other recruits kind of respected her, and beyond all of that, she was Izuku's most potent weakness, attractive. Like, she was unreasonably pretty. None of the girls back home ever looked like that. It might just be her red hair, or the fact that she was more or less the first girl his age he'd seen in months, but still, Isuka was just, wow. And she was a tomboy, which apparently he was into. Isuka swatted his mop again and smirked at him before she slapped her mop back down onto the floor and continued mopping. Several of the other recruits laughed while they leaned on their mops, doing more talking than working while their C-ults chatted alongside them. Even if Isuka had respect, she was still a fresh recruit and expected to do the cleaning. Right alongside him. Right, Izuku muttered and looked at the floor. He could nearly see his own reflection in the shine they were leaving behind. So, what's it like? Isuka asked as she stuck near him, her eyes meeting his through the reflection for a brief moment. Izuku looked up at her while they continued to swab. That was what swabbing was, right? Mopping. He had a vague idea of what the poop deck was. Having a devil fruit power. Isuka's smile was easy to look at and had his heart beating strong enough that he could feel it in his bruised fingers. She paused for a moment, resting her hands on her mop handle for a moment as she gestured at him. She always wore a glove over her left hand, which was a detail that stood out to him for some reason. I mean, it's rare for a recruit to have a devil fruit already. Normally only commissioned officers are allowed to eat them. Them and pirates. Izuku stopped, the mop resting against his shoulder as he thought about what that really meant. I don't really know. I just ate a really bad-tasting fruit and then all of a sudden I could control the wind. And I'm still figuring out how I'm really doing all of that. Well, from the show you put on being chased by a sea king while flying through the air with nothing but a sail. Isuka laughed, her smile growing wider. I mean, come on, you have to be crazy to even think of doing something like that. Well, I was desperate. Zebra. Who? That sea king. You named it? Yeah, mostly because calling it my impending doom wasn't the best thing for morale. Izuku shrugged. Did they even have zebras in this world? Was it still called a zebra? Fish were still fish, so probably. Basically, he was destroying the island I was staying on, so I had to escape. Which was why I had to do that crazy thing I did. Really? Why was he doing that? And why was chasing you afterwards? Isuka glanced up towards the ceiling and then snapped her fingers. Your wind, right? That's what Garp and Bogard think. Apparently there being wind in the calm belt is strange enough that it must have angered the Sea Kings. But then why did the other one save you? Isuka tapped on her mop and started anew again, kicking her bucket further down the walkway. Not the enemy. Izuku's head pounded and his ears popped as he recalled that moment, that booming impossible voice that sounded like it was coming from both that poodle Sea King and inside his head all at once. Garp didn't care, but Bogard seems to think it was just pure chance and that it was a territory dispute. And what do you think? Izuku pushed his mop along the floor and glanced out the window once more. I don't know what to think. I'm just happy I'm alive. Suhi, Isuka placed her hand over her mouth as she gave a light chuckle. I bet. Still, the ability to control the wind. I can see why Garp was so interested in you now. Why is that? Well, think about it. Isuka pointed towards the sea. Out here on the open sea, the two biggest things we can't control are the sea and the wind. She winked at him. And with you, we can now control the wind. I don't think you can underestimate just how important that devil fruit power is. Izuku felt his cheeks burn at the praise. Well, I just hope I can use this power to save as many people as possible. Isuka stopped and looked at him. You know what, Flyboy, you're pretty alright? Thanks, I think Before he could even figure out what he was going to say, the alarm bell rang, echoing throughout the entire ship. All hands on deck. The CEO clapped his hands as the other rookies raced to their stations, some even bouncing into each other in panic. Isuka, newbie, you put this stuff away and, someone bring me the newbie. Garp's voice boomed throughout the entire ship louder and more clear than the alarm bell. And some cannonballs. The CEO sighed and gestured at another set of recruits. You two, put the stuff away then report on deck. Isuka, take Izuku up to see Garp. I know, he was about to say he didn't need a guide to find where Garp was. It was strong to miss him, but Isuka grabbed his arm. Roger, sir. Isuka pulled Izuku up a nearby set of stairs and smiled at him. The order was for someone to bring you to him. I don't think Garp meant it that way. He really didn't feel the need to protest as they maneuvered through scores of other Marines all getting to their stations. He can be oddly literal when it comes to orders. Isuka stopped as a train of cannonballs rushed past them. Kind of like that. Besides, my station is in the upper rigging right now, so I need to be on deck. The upper decks of the warship was an organized chaos with dozens of Marines prepping the ship for the battle. Standing on the dog-headed mast of his ship was Garp, his Marine coat off as he stood with his arms crossed, glaring out at sea. Izuku glanced up at the sails. They were as flat and lifeless as they had been every day they'd been in the comm belt. It clicked before Isuka had dragged him all the way to Garp. His new family wanted him to use his devil fruit. Could he move a whole ship with his wind? Vice Admiral Garp. Isuka shouted as they ascended to the large platform just behind the figurehead. I brought you the flyboy. Garp turned with a stern look on his face. And where are those cannonballs I asked for? Isuka saluted and let go of Izuku's arm. On their way, sir. Without another word, she darted off. Why was Garp asking for cannonballs? He was going to throw them, wasn't he? You're here, Izuku. Wah. Right on time. Come here. Garp laughed and gestured for Izuku to join him on the figurehead. The figurehead was a bit more slippery than the deck, and with the sea directly below them, Izuku was vaguely concerned about falling off, especially since that would mean going under the ship. But those concerns were nothing compared to his nearly suicidal voyage he had taken to get this far. He could stand without a guardrail. What do you see? Garp asked as he gestured towards the ocean. Izuku strained his eyes as he saw a few things that he hadn't seen in the comm belt. Clouds on the horizon, and what looked like a rough sea towards part way out. The Grand Line. Well, I guess that's true, but I was talking about the pirate ship. Garp pointed his finger right towards a spot on the horizon. It was tiny, close to a speck, but just beyond the tallest wave, he could make out a set of red sails. They're out of the comm belt. Izuku looked towards the sea, then pointed at the gray clouds on the horizon. And if we saw them, they probably saw us. And since they have wind power, we won't be able to catch them. Izuku paused and felt his fingers twitch. No, it wasn't his fingers. It was something else. That something else he had been training since he ate that fruit. His devil fruit. Even from here, he could feel the wind just a few miles away. You want me to push the ship so we can catch them? He glanced up at Garp, who had tears in his eyes. Without warning, Garp grabbed him in a powerful hug. You have no idea how glad I am that you're actually smart. His new grandfather was a very emotional person. It still felt good though, considering his largely absent father from his last world. Now, Izuku let out a small, canine-like yelp when Garp grabbed him by the back of his neck and pulled him back. Get to work. Really, standing near Garp should have been warning enough, as Izuku found himself being tossed all the way across the ship and near the helm where a confused Bogard stood at the wheel. Izuku landed on one foot, stumbling twice before he tumbled all the way to the wall and then sat upside down. You two seem to be getting along well, Bogard chuckled and looked towards the sails. Almost makes me think you've been family your whole life. Is it normal to throw your family across a ship? Izuku asked as he stood. No, but for him it is. Bogard placed both hands on the helm and stared straight ahead. I'm not normally the helmsman, but since this is our first time going on Izuku power, I figure I'd better be there to help you out. Thanks. Izuku scratched the back of his head and stood in the most open part of the ship he could. I'm not sure if I'll be able to do this though. Really? Bogard kept his eyes forward, but Izuku could see the smile pulling on the side of his face. Because I am. Oh look, encouragement. He looked up at the mast and spotted Isuka in the upper rigging, running along the boom with ease as she tied parts of the mast. She was really nimble and agile. She caught him staring and gave him a thumbs up. With red cheeks, he looked back down towards that distant ship on the horizon and closed his eyes. Breathe. His goal was simple: A large, strong, and continuous gust coming from behind the ship and heading towards that pirate ship. The stillness of the calm belt came over him. It felt like a tranquil koi pond where there was barely a ripple. And he was just a kid with a rock. A big butt rock. The tranquil calmness was destroyed violently. He didn't so much gather the wind behind him as much as he simply made it. The air started off as a light breeze that tickled the back of his neck and made the sails taut. Then he kicked it up, moving from breeze, to wind, to gust in a few quick moments. 10 degrees starboard Izuku. Bogart's voice pulled him out of his trance. He saw the tall, capped man pointing towards his right. With both hands extended in front of him, Izuku tilted his body slightly, the wind following alongside him. The sails were fully deployed, and the entire ship shook as it caught the wind for the first time in days. "That's it," Bogard shouted with a wide smile on his face as he looked back towards Izuku, his cape fluttering in the wind as they pushed through the stillness. "Keep that heading and we'll cut them off, right?" Izuku grunted. He locked onto a specific spot on the sails to keep his direction the same, a knot along the mainyard second from the right. "And can you increase the power?" "How much?" 50%? That rock got even bigger. Izuku breathed and focused, his eyes locking onto that knot as he pushed the wind harder, the backlash sending his hair flying in front of his face as it pushed the ship faster. Several Marines stumbled on the deck from the sudden acceleration, followed by a few more hoots and hollers from the crew. "Way to go, flyboy!" Isuka cheered from the upper rigging, practically sidewise as she held onto a rope with a foot planted on the main mast. "Wah!" Garp bellowed from in front of the ship. "Just like that, my boy. Keep us steady. And where are my DMN cannonball?" Before long, they exited the comm belt, and that ship on the horizon grew closer. He had been drowning and not even aware of it. What should have felt like trying to grab a single straw out of a mile-high pile of hay was instead a simple, elegant brush, all the strands doing what he wanted when he needed. The calmness of the comm belt had been actively hampering what he was now, its lack of winds choking and pushing him under as he struggled to find a breath in that confined space. In there, he had to struggle to create the wind. Out here, in the Grand Line, he could grab the wind. Izuku gasped the moment his body left the impossibly well-defined line that separated the comm belt from the rest of the world. His head pounded, his stomach lurched, and the wind, he could feel it. He could feel it touching the sea and the ships, with such clarity it felt like he was a kid in the bath with a RBB ducky. "Oh!" Bogard shouted as the ship rocked, the speed nearly doubling for a brief second before Izuku got it back under control. More than a few Marines had fallen due to the sudden rocking, while many more were holding onto the rigging with new desperation. "Izuku!" "Sorry," he shouted and pushed his hand forward, this time not to push the wind forward, but to pull it back, just enough to maintain the speed. It was such a shift. He had gone from struggling to have any effect to having so much power that he was struggling to control it. If this was what his power was like on a windy day, what would it be in the middle of a storm? He took in a deep breath. It felt full, crisp, and charged, like the first real breath after getting over a cold, and looked towards the pirates still getting closer. He took a step forward, angling his body as he reached for it. He could see the red sails full of wind, and then he could feel them. He could feel the wind pushing against those sails, making the ship move forward. "Izuku!" Bogard shouted from the helm, his fedora still somehow attached to his head. "What are you doing?" His breath felt like a hurricane. "I think." He reached out for those distant sails and then twisted his hand. The wind over there twisted and turned with him, those red sails buckling, the ship rocking. "I think I can," he gasped, letting out a breath he hadn't been aware of as his mind felt like it was about to break. He was reaching too far, spreading his concern too far. "Stop them." The red sails fell flat. Izuku dropped to a knee, his hand shaking. He felt a bit of moisture on his upper lip, and he could taste copper. His eyes were still locked onto that distant ship, even while his body was still here, filling the white sails of Garp's warship without ripping them apart. His ears popped, and he felt dizzy, dizzier than he had ever felt before. The entire sea spun around him as he kept focus on those red sails growing ever closer. Part of him was at least aware of the cannonball that Garp had thrown without even looking at it. "Huh. Got them." Is that a new record? Wow! Garp shouted from the front of the ship. He must have hit. Izuku began to fall forward. His body felt fine, but his mind was so tired. Izuku! Before he hit the side of the ship, Bogard had slid over and caught him before he fell. Are you okay? Izuku nodded slowly. I think I overdid it a bit. Bogard sighed and rolled his eyes as he stood both of them up and guided Izuku over towards the wheel, carefully placing a hand onto the smooth and polished wood that was worn by countless hands grabbing and spinning it. Is this going to be a normal thing with you? What? Giving me a heart attack in surprising ways, Bogard supported Izuku, placing his hands over Izuku's on the wheel as he slowly guided Izuku in guiding the entire ship. When we first met, you were literally flying and being chased by a sea king, and now you've stopped a pirate ship dead in its tracks? A soft cloth pressed against Izuku's nose from Bogard's hand, and Izuku held it in place, thankful that he might not have enough BLD in him to blush. The flying thing had been pure desperation and his will to live. Almost passing out stopping a ship was another story entirely. That and the nosebleed was another thing entirely. You have a powerful devil fruit under your control, one that can turn the tides of any maritime battle, and what you just showed us has made me even more excited to see how you'll develop. For now, take things easy and give us a light breeze forward while I show you how to steer. Izuku looked up with wide eyes. You want me to be a helmsman? Ha! Bogard gave a great big smile and patted Izuku on the back. Oh, you'll be far more than that. Far, far more. What? Garp shouted from the front of the ship, a cannonball still firmly gripped in his hand in a way that made Izuku wonder if Garp had more power in one of his hands than Izuku had in his entire body, or if it would take just a single finger. They're surrendering already. Apparently, even pirates didn't like being a sitting target. Wait, Izuku blinked and looked up towards Bogard. If we arrest them, where am I going to sleep? His room was still one of the empty jail cells for the time being. It was nice, mostly because he had seen the barracks for the other Marines, and was more than happy to avoid sleeping next to so many others. We'll figure something out. Wow! Garp gave a great big laugh as he stood on the deck of the pirate ship. Every one of the pirates on board had their hands bound behind their back by large metal shackles, or were tied with rope. The captain of the crew was a bald man with a large red beard that curved so far upwards it nearly acted as hair. Many of the pirates looked exactly how Izuku would have pictured them, mean-faced, missing teeth, and like they didn't know what a bath was. Not that Izuku had much room to talk about that last point. He hadn't taken a proper bath since he got here. You lot had some rotten luck. Garp laughed, both hands on his hips. You just so happened to be sailing by when I was dead eager to test out my crew and see what they could do. How'd you stop the wind? The pirate captain shouted. A red, 9-headed hydra was printed on the back of his jacket. The rest of his crew had a similar design. Apparently these guys were the Red Hydra crew, which kind of just sounded like they showed up late to get their pirate crew name. What sort of trick is that? Garp asked, finger already up his nose. He pulled out a small beaded booger and flicked it at the pirate with enough force to knock him on his butt. My son did it. Izuku found all eyes were on him as they followed Garp's thumb that was oh so casually directed right at Izuku. Years of being a nervous and skittish kid hit him, and he bowed slightly towards the pirates. Sorry. Why was he apologizing? You should be thanking him. Wow. Garp bellowed and rolled his shoulders. I was just getting warmed up when you lot surrendered. If that hadn't happened, we'd be fishing you out of the water. There was a mumbling around the pirates as they glanced at the damage one of Garp's cannonballs had done to their ship. Now then, you're all arrested. Garp clapped his hands and gestured for Bogard to take over. Squeeze as many of them as you can in the cells, then we'll start figuring out a ghost crew to get this ship to port. Garp started to walk towards the interior of the ship and then stopped. Oh, and by the way, we're going to Marineford, so you low lives get the 5-star cells. The entire pirate crew seemed to groan, accepting their fates readily and easily. Izuku, come with me and grab something to write with. We're going to see what these pirates got. Izuku grunted as Isuka slammed a clipboard and pen into his hand and then leapt over the railing, joining Garp on the pirate ship with ease. Izuku, not quite trusting his ability to jump nearly 10 feet over open ocean, walked around to the boarding plank and then rushed to Garp's side, doing his best to ignore the glares from the pirates as Bogard began to round them up. "So, hey, what was all that?" Izuku asked the moment they entered the interior of the ship. Her green eyes sparkled in the dim light, and her smile seemed far too excited for someone that had just climbed up and down a mast like 20 times. "Like the wind thing. You were in control, then all of a sudden you were in turbo drive and some of us nearly fell off. And then you did the wind thing over here. How'd you do that?" Izuku, that's a lot of booze," Garp shouted as he wandered into the pirates' mess hall. "Hey, rookies, come mark this down." The sound of a cork being popped, followed by a belch, made both Izuku and Izuku sigh. Not this one though, captain's privilege. Izuku entered the mess hall and found that it was oddly well kept for a bunch of pirates. He marked down the foodstuff as best he could, and even marked the booze. "So?" Izuku asked, leaning in close, so close that her hand grazed his upper arm for a moment. She then took a step back, quickly writing down something else. "You gonna finish?" "I don't know. It was weird," Izuku muttered as he kept his hands firmly onto the paper, scribbling away at whatever he saw. "I could just feel the moment we left the comm belt, and it was like I could finally breathe. Like I didn't have to struggle to use my quirk anymore." "Quirk? Sorry, devil fruit?" It was going to take a while for him to stop calling it a quirk though. It felt like a quirk, it acted like a quirk, right? But anyways, it was weird. It was like I could feel the wind better once I got out of the comm belt. So, I might have gone a bit overboard with the speed. Judging by the dry BLD under your nose, I think you went overboard in general. Izuku poked his side and smiled at him. "But what about the wind thing? How'd you stop the ship?" "I don't know." Izuku tried to recall that exact moment, but it felt so foggy, like his mind was being pulled in every direction like the wind and he was barely able to keep it steady. "I think that I just reached out and made the wind stop." "Whatever stops the wind in the comm belt probably had some effect on you as well," Garp started as he opened up a cupboard. "It was probably why you were on that Sea King's menu as well. Either way, you did good today." "Thanks, right? You don't have to force it, brat. Just for that, you're getting extra training." Izuku made the grave mistake of laughing. "And you're joining him?" Now it was Izuku's turn to laugh. He doubted that Garp's training would be much worse than his time surviving on the island. And at least he wouldn't be suffering alone. He reached for a large cupboard and opened it. There was an eep. Then a rattling of chains. Izuku found himself staring at a mature woman dressed in rags. Her brown hair was tied in a messy bun, and she looked beaten and battered far more than any of the pirates he had seen before. What's more, she looked completely terrified. "The Sylvia." Garp grunted as he made his way over towards the cupboard and pulled the woman out. He grabbed her shackles and crushed them with his hand, startling the woman far more as she cried out in terror. Garp let out a deep sigh and let the woman go, and she instantly pushed away, moving into the nearest corner. "We're going below deck, there might be more." There were a lot more. The only part of his body that didn't hurt was his eyes. Everything else was either sore, bruised, cut, battered, or otherwise damaged in some aspect from his daily life on the sea. Even his wind hurt. Which was weird considering how it wasn't actually a part of him, but whatever it was that was letting him control the wind was feeling fatigue from near constant use since they had gotten out of the comm belt. First it was chasing down and disabling a pirate ship, and now it was helping them make a record pace towards Marineford, more or less going against the air currents. At first it wasn't strong, but it was a bit like lifting a weight up and then holding it there perfectly still. Izuku panted from above him, her red hair catching bits of starlight as she stumbled towards him. If she looked like that, he must look 10 times worse. She let out a gasp and sat down beside him, her long pointed sword, a rapier or something, falling to the side. "You really don't know the first thing about fighting, do you?" Izuku groaned and closed his eyes. He could easily fall asleep right now. It was insane. After doing his full day of chores, he was expected to hop over to the pirate ship and then train with Garp and Izuku until he couldn't move, or Garp decided to call it off. There was some part of him that wondered where he was getting the energy to so much as sleep, but here he was. It had been 4 days since they had entered the Grand Line and 4 days of near constant training. He honestly wasn't sure he had anything to show for it other than bruises. Though he really shouldn't be surprised. It had only been 4 days, and he hadn't eaten any fancy fruit that'll just make him a god at fighting. Sorry, he muttered, staring up at the stars. They were pretty and so far away. I ate a fruit that lets me control wind, not fight good. Wah! Garp bellowed from his seat. He had taken to sitting on the stairs that led up to helm of the pirate ship, and looked equal parts massive and comfortable. Don't fret, my boy. We all gotta start from somewhere. Just so happens you're starting out from zero. The closest thing to a sword he'd ever held before showing up in this world was a stick that he pretended was a sword. Wait, there was that one time when he attempted to join the kendo club. That didn't end well, though. Do you think maybe a sword just isn't a good match for him? Isuka asked, her hair fluttering in the wind. She took in several deep breaths as she waited for Garp to answer her. Nah, Garp waved his hand at the notion. Can't really make that call until he can actually put up a fight with the demon thing. If he wasn't so tired, he was pretty sure that line would have sent his self-confidence down the drain. Well, further down the drain. Though, there's something about being a swordsman, I suppose. Garp stood and gave a long stretch that ended with his back popping loud enough that the marine on patrol on the other ship gave a slight jump. Izuku sat up, wincing at the pain, and looked Garp in the eyes. Why is that? Don't know, I fight with my fists and I never have much of a problem. And cannonballs. Garp also fought by throwing literal cannonballs at people. And it was effective. Somehow. But there's something about people that call themselves swordsmen. They all have the same goal. They all want to be the best swordsman in the world. It's some kind of pride thing. Garp looked over at Isuka, still sitting on the deck next to Izuku. Isuka, don't you have some of that pride too? Isuka stammered as she stood to her feet, her rapier in her hands as she looked at it for a moment. I mean, kind of. I want to improve and be a good swordsman, but, I don't think I'll ever be able to match Hawkeye Mihawk. Garp gave a great big snort and placed both hands on his hips. Not with that attitude. He's got an excuse. Garp gestured broadly at Izuku for a moment. Boys barely got stick them with the pointy end down. You though, I'd be lying if I didn't say you don't have the talent. You just gotta believe in yourself. Isuka's face was practically glowing in the starlit night. She clutched her rapier close to her and gave a short bow. I'll do my best, Vice Admiral. You better, or else I'll be dead before you can prove me right. Wow! With a great big laugh, Garp marched over to where the two of them were resting and then squatted down in front of Izuku. Even while sitting up, Garp's knees were still above Izuku's head. At least he knew that it wasn't all humans that grew that big, but, was he going to be short in this world or something? And you, it's almost like you've never even seen someone wield a sword before. Amnesia. Bah. Garp waved him off. As your grandpa, I know when you're lying. Grandpa. Which was it? Felt like it changed whenever Garp felt like. Which it probably did. Was it based on when Izuku did something good? More information would be needed. Well, whatever. Garp began to pick his nose again and sighed. You've already impressed me far more than most Marines ever do. I guess expecting you to be an expert fighter right off the bat is asking a bit much. At the very least, you make great Sea King bait. Why don't I use my Chew Devil fruit to fight? Do you know how? Well, figure it out. Garp stood and dusted off his legs. Just not on board a ship. Last thing we need is a blade of wind cutting through the sails. He let out a long yawn and stretched side to side. Probably find some place to train once we get to Marineford. In the meantime, Isuka, you're in charge of making sure he doesn't die if we get in a fight. Does that mean I'm off rigging duty? No. Then how? You're resourceful, you figure it out. Come on, Izuku, can't you push us a little faster? Yeah, we're almost there. Just one big gust and we'll be on dry land. Izuku looked around at the crew. Many of them already had their bags at the ready, and the entire ship had never looked so spotless. Even the mess hall was completely clean, as everyone was excited for what was to come. Shore leave. And Izuku could see why, too. Looming just on the horizon was Marineford, the HQ of the Marines, and the place that would likely be his home on land for the foreseeable future. Many of these Marines were fresh recruits, going there for training and processing before they would be shipped off to various fleets, forts, and captains around the world. A few might even stay at the base as logistics/grunt workers for a time. For once, Izuku's future wasn't quite as uncertain as theirs. He'd be staying with Garp for the foreseeable future. Something about not letting the others mess him up or something. At least until he could be the captain of his own ship, but even then he'd probably still be under Garp's command. Which was fine, though it might lead to his death. Which was less fine. Izuku gave a dry laugh and looked back towards Bogard, who had both hands on the helm and a smirk on his face. Keep us at a steady pace, Izuku. We're already a week ahead of schedule. A few extra minutes won't kill 'em. It was as if the entire crew groaned as they shuffled their way onto the main deck. A large pile of stuff was already sitting near the center mast, as the Marine recruits were eager to start the next leg of their journey. If Izuku had stuff, he'd likely have had his own bag down there. You seem excited, Izuku. Bogard gave a small chuckle as the crew worked their ways down the stairs. More so than them at any rate. Well, it's my first time seeing a city. Izuku looked towards Marineford. Even from here he could make out the details of the fortress city, and he couldn't help but think that the large keep at the center looked a bit like many of the old castles from Japan. So, I'm excited to do a lot of things. Like bathe. And eat good food. Well, I know a few places that have good food in the city, though, you might want to be careful in the baths. That got Izuku's attention. Why? Well, since you have a devil fruit, being submerged in water can make things difficult for you. More than a few devil fruit users have died because they couldn't get out of the bath. Izuku opened his mouth and felt his world fall out from under him. He was Japanese. How could he live without taking a bath? That was basically as essential to his being as eating and breathing. Sure, he didn't need them to be alive, but, still. He wanted to relax in the bath and feel clean for the first time in weeks. Bogard gave a slight chuckle and nodded towards Izuku. Just make sure you go in there with someone and you'll be fine. If you're going for the public baths, it shouldn't be too much of a problem, though I can't speak about how clean you'd get in there. Well, think about it. Lots of off-duty Marines, not every one of them is going to rinse before, and fewer are going to be as thorough as they ought to be. So, you might want to stay away from the free baths during busy hours. Izuku felt his eye twitch. These people were barbarians. I guess I'll figure something out then. He sighed and stared off at those shores as they grew ever closer. He wondered if they had ramen. Well, if you're going to mope about it, I guess I won't show you how to pull a ship into port. That got Izuku's attention again. He jumped over toward Bogard and stood at attention. Recruit Izuku reporting for duty. That's more like it. Now then, the currents are, there was something about how Bogard explained the process of steering a ship that drew Izuku in. He could feel it for just a few moments at a time, that the vessel was becoming a part of who he was, every movement of the wheel, and how it connected to the drive, and how that movement would turn the ship. Of course he would learn how to pilot a sailing ship before he learned how to drive a car. It was just past midday when they finally docked at Marineford. Despite the fact that the city had nothing on a place like Tokyo in sheer scale, the fact that this entire island was both a city and a fort was amazing. The scale of it all had Izuku more than a bit excited to see what it had to offer. All right, Bogard shouted from the deck, a clipboard in his hand as many of the new Marine recruits were already beginning to line up. New recruits, line up with me. We need to get you to the processing office, and then, Izuku started to move to line up with the others, but a firm hand on his shoulder from Garp stopped him. Shouldn't I line up with everyone else? He already saw Isuka lining up with everyone as well. Nope, you're special. Garp laughed and then picked Izuku up with ease. First of all, you're my brat now. Second of all, you've got a devil fruit, meaning you get special treatment. But hey. Izuku struggled as Garp promptly shouldered him like he was nothing more than a potato sack. Quit struggling, I'm old. You throw cannonballs? Izuku kicked as he struggled against Garp's gorilla grip. Don't worry about it, Izuku, one of the other recruits shouted from the main deck. We all kind of figured it was going to happen, especially with how you joined the crew in the first place. Hope we meet again. Izuku looked at the crew and felt like his eyes were beginning to water. It wasn't until he met Isuka's eyes again that he finally stopped struggling. She gave a small nod at him with a confident smile on her face. Even if this was a goodbye for now, it wouldn't be forever. Besides, they were all in Marineford, so he could easily find her again while they were both still here. Hold on tight. Garp laughed and leapt from the ship. It was easy to think that this was the peace he had been fighting for all his life. But it wasn't. More and more pirates were sprouting up each and every day, many of them children that had heard Roger's last words. It was like they were still echoing along with his laugh. It didn't matter that Roger had died. He wasn't laughing at his death, he wasn't laughing at his captors. He was laughing with them. His laugh was one of a man that had lived life to the fullest, one that had no regrets. And a promise of a life like that was too much for so many. Sengoku sighed as he looked across Marineford. With the gates of justice closed, it was calm, calmer than usual, with barely any waves breaking in the harbor, and barely enough wind to actually sail. It was the kind of day where boys and girls would stare out to sea and imagine grand adventures, of fighting bad guys and saving people. Though that could just be him reminiscing of his own childhood. I wonder, he scratched at his chin and sighed. If I had heard Roger's words as a child. He shook his head and then glanced down at the docks as a familiar ship came into port. Most marine ships were standardized, but there were a few eccentrics in the Marines that liked to customize their ships. In this case, it was the familiar dog-head figurehead of his friend, and constant annoyance, Monkey D. Garp, who had a nasty habit of ignoring his den mushy. I'd lecture him, but he'd probably just not care. Sengoku sighed and popped his neck. To say Garp was a headache would be an understatement. If it wasn't for his status as the hero of the Marines, he probably would have been discharged years ago. Or be forced to take the position of admiral. Speaking of which, he still needed to talk to Kazan about his decision. The man was a powerful vice-admiral, albeit with a bit too much Garp influence. But compared to Akainu and Kazarp, maybe that was a good thing. Lazy justice might just be the thing to temper those two. Light, lava, and ice, that would certainly make for a powerful trio of admirals. More than enough to keep the warlords in check, and possibly put some pressure on the emperors in the New World. Though Whitebeard himself seemed to be doing a fine job of that, alongside that red-hair Shanks. Sengoku glanced once more out towards the ocean and gave a deep sigh. The pieces were there, weren't they? They were all just waiting there, ticking time bombs waiting for something to set them off. Be that Edward Newgate's death, or some unknown event, there was little that he could do but attempt to be ready for it to come. But he could get ready for Garp to come breaking into his office and stealing his snacks. Maybe even his sake. It had been a while since he and Garp had actually gone drinking. Lord knows I might need it. With that, he made his way towards his office. Knowing Garp, he'd probably be the last one off the ship, and even then, he'd take his sweet time getting to where he needed to be. Or he was already in Sengoku's office eating his snacks and drinking his sake. Garp time was strange like that. His office was clear, his snack drawer secured, and his sake was still sealed. Everything was in the absolute same spot that he had left it, with the only mess being a few reports Sengoku had been going through before deciding to take a walk to clear his head. More and more pirates were popping up, while recruitment was down. There were plenty of causes beyond Roger's words resonating with the youth. For many, there were far worse fates than becoming pirates. Sengoku tightened his fist and smiled. He fully understood Garp's reason for refusing the promotions so many times. And honestly, Sengoku was more than a little jealous about it. Sengoku. Garp's voice shook the walls of Marineford almost as much as the man slamming open of his office door. It was enough for several pictures to fall from their perches and his papers to slide to the side. Garp busted into the room with a gigantic smile on his face, one that would be more commonplace after a few dozen drinks. Look what I got. Of all the things Sengoku had expected, sake from Ueno, fresh bison walrus meat, a resignation letter, a scared shitless green-haired toothpick in a marine uniform was not on the list. Is that Ace? What? No, this is my kid. Izuku. Garp held this Izuku up like he was a prize trophy and shook him about a bit. The poor kid looked somewhere between shaken and stirred. And get this. This one actually wants to be a marine. What? And it gets even better. He says that he wants to be a hero too. Wah. Garp laughed so strong that tears had appeared in the corners of his eyes. Which wasn't that odd. What was odd was the sheer amount of pride that Garp had on his face, especially when talking about the kid wanting to be a hero. Sengoku sighed and then pinched his nose. He knew this kid wasn't actually Garp's. The features weren't there, and Garp hadn't been committed since she passed away. How different would the world have been if she was still around? I understand you have a habit of picking up strays, but what's his story? You're going to love this. Doubtful. I found this kid running away from a sea king in the middle of a calm belt. He was flying. It was the best thing ever. Garp grabbed Izuku's arms and pointed towards the rope burn-like scars that ran up and down the boy's arms. Those must have been painful. He was holding tight onto an old marine ship's sail while gliding on the wind. And the beast that was chasing him was huge. Easily the biggest I'd ever seen. Just think about the ball to attempt that. Using a sail to fall slowly and safely was a common tactic for ships and people attempting to get down from the Sky Islands, but there were no such Sky Islands in the calm belts, and even if there were, a Sea King likely wouldn't be chasing after a lone boy floating down. And Garp said flying. What do you mean flying? You're going to love this part. Garp finally placed Izuku down, and the boy wavered on. His feet for a moment, clearly still shocked by everything that was happening. But first, sign this. Garp pulled out a carefully folded set of papers and then handed them towards Sengoku. He's mine, and I expect you to respect that. Sengoku took the papers and then rolled his eyes. Adoption papers. Monkey D. Izuku. Another D, was that Garp's doing? Did it matter? Sengoku quickly signed the top paper and handed it to Garp before signing the other two, placing them in his stack of paperwork to process through later. There, the Marines officially recognize him as your kid. At least this time, Izuku had signed the papers. Now what am I going to love? Hold on, let the kid get his bearings for a second. Garp casually picked his nose and then moved towards the window. And whose fault was it that the kid looked ready to throw up? Being dragged around by an excited Garp had to be rougher than any sea. Garp opened the window and pointed towards one of the watchtowers. Hey boy, so he was boy now. Make that flag go straight up. Sengoku raised an eyebrow and stared at Izuku as he slowly regained his wits. He watched as the boy slowly moved towards the window, then stretched out his hands. It wasn't uncommon for devil fruit users to need to do motions like that to control their powers, especially those just starting out, but even veterans had a strong time breaking the habit. It took all of Sengoku's willpower to not pose like a Buddha every time he used his devil fruit. The normally quiet air within his office took a violent turn as it fluttered about Izuku for a brief moment, causing his carefully stacked papers to ruffle and slide along the desk slightly. Far off on the distant watchtower on one of the 4 rocky pillars that surrounded Marineford, the flag that had once been lazily following the wind was now sticking straight up. The soldier stationed there was gripping his hat in confusion over what was happening. Logia? Sengoku asked. Garp shrugged. Not as far as we can tell. Sengoku hummed and gave a small nod. How strong? Garp placed a hand on Izuku's shoulder and grinned down at the boy, then up at Sengoku. We had full sails all the way here. He even stopped a pirate ship dead in the sea. Sengoku looked at Izuku again. The boy was steady now, and he looked nervous, bashful, but ultimately happy. How difficult were those things for you? Well, the boy shook his head and then bowed. I mean, it's an honor to meet you, Fleet Admiral Sengoku. I'm Marine Recruit Izuku Demi Monkey. Sengoku laughed. He hadn't been expecting that. Well, I can tell you didn't learn those manners from Garp. I'm guessing Bogard taught you that. Izuku nodded. That's right, sir. Izuku gave a proper salute and then took a breath. It's a lot easier to control the wind here than it was to make the wind in the calm belt. He rubbed the scars along his arms for a moment. So giving full sail to a ship or two is really easy, but stopping the wind gets harder the further away I am. He shouldn't be looking at this young recruit purely as a military asset, but it was so strong not to. The gates of justice all but solidified marine control in the waters that surrounded them due to the speed at which they could respond to threats in the area. A trip of days was reduced by a handful of hours. With proper training, Izuku could do that to whatever fleet he was assigned to. Few pirates would be safe at sea. Garp placed both hands on Izuku's shoulders, a firm look on his face. I'll be training him in Rokushiki now that I've unloaded all those recruits. And he was being trained by Garp. Those long drunken talks about making a difference by training the next generation were already looking less like ramblings and more about dreams. And hockey? Garp shrugged. Bogard thinks so, but he hasn't awakened it yet. Izuku looked up in confusion at the two. Hockey? Bah, don't worry about it. Garp shook his new son's adoptive shoulders a bit, and then smiled down at him. You'll know soon enough. I look forward to seeing you grow, Izuku. I hope you'll do us proud. Yes, sir. Part of Sengoku wondered how long that optimism would last. Probably right up until Izuku has his first encounter with a celestial dragon. He just hoped Garp would be able to show him the good the Marines do despite them. Somehow being back on civilized dry land was more exhausting than actually sailing. It had taken over a day and a half for Garp to stop running around with him, introducing him to people and showing him what kind of training he was going to be getting during their 2-week stay here and on once they were on the ship. Part of him was excited for it all. He had seen what that training would bring firsthand thanks to some demonstrations, but most of him, or rather all of him, was simply too exhausted to even be excited about some of those things. He was drained both physically and mentally, and while he had already eaten a bit of food his stomach was still growling. But there was one important matter that Izuku desperately needed to address. Cleanliness. Not just of the body but of the soul. He placed Garp's bath pass in the basket along with his clothes and stared out past the other Marines that were looking at him strangely. At first he thought that it might be that he was the only one getting naked, but it turned out more than a few of them were as well. The real reason was likely because he was still just a kid and he didn't have the rank of captain. He was here through pure nepotism and he was more than okay with that if it meant being able to take a bath. A proper bath. One where he could go in properly cleaned and let the pure warm water carry away his earthly worries. The baths were a spectacle, equal parts large, ornate, and hearty. They had the kind of aroma that made Izuku feel like he was back in Japan. It was almost as nostalgic as the ramen stand he had spied while Garp and Sengoku had dragged him around Marineford. And that was what he was going to have to eat tomorrow as soon as Garp and Sengoku stopped being various kinds of drunk. Wasn't Sengoku the fleet admiral? Why was he allowed to get hammered with someone like Garp? Izuku sighed and began the lengthy process of cleaning himself. He was pretty sure that the moment the water touched him it became a toxic bile of sweat, salty, and whatever other grim he had managed to get. Oi! A firm voice drawled from behind him. Izuku paused, pushing some of the water out of his eyes to see a tall, very tall, like taller than Garp tall, man in a very small towel, like smaller than his towel. The man was slender, with puffy black hair and a muscular frame. You're an officer? Izuku swallowed and stared at the man for a moment. He had no idea how to address someone like this. And he was pretty sure that he was about to be kicked out. Not that he didn't have permission to be here, Garp, and even Sengoku said it was okay, but that didn't mean this guy knew. No, but Garp said. Garp? The large man squatted down at the cleaning station beside him. His knees were above Izuku's eye level. Why are you addressing him so familiarly? Izuku swallowed and he heard the sound of someone taking the other station next to him. He looked back and saw a man with a cigar in his mouth and pure white hair. He looked various levels of pissed. Well, Vice Admiral Garp is my father, sir. I'm Izuku, a new recruit. He said I could use his pass to clean myself off since the public baths tend to be. See-hole. The white-haired man said as an obscene amount of smoke poured out of his mouth. Yeah, Izuku resumed his cleaning as the other two were doing so as well. And since I have a devil fruit, Sengoku didn't want me to be alone in case I fell asleep. The tall man with black hair snorted at that. It sounds silly, but just last month we had to pull out a captain that had relaxed a bit too much. That was one time, the white-haired man growled. I'm Kazan, by the way. The tall man with puffy black hair extended an absolutely massive hand towards Izuku. I have a lot of respect for Garp, so if he says you can be here, I'll say the same. So this was Kazan. Izuku took the man's hand and found it cold to the touch, and his grip felt deadly, even more so than Garp's. And that man behind you is Smoker. Kazan nodded towards the white-haired man who grunted in acknowledgement. He became a captain not too long ago and I'm going to take the title of admiral. Smoker finished for him. Kazan gave a sigh that was almost as big as the man himself. That hasn't been decided yet. I wanted to talk to Garp before I made any choice. What's to decide? You're the best fit for the bill and we need someone to cool off Akainu. Izuku had no idea what they were talking about, but he understood one thing. Mr. Kazan, I think if you're being offered the admiral position, that you should take it. When Garp and Sengoku were talking early, he said you'd be a good pick. Did he now? Kazan hummed and scratched his chin. There was a slow, lazy drawl to Kazan's whole personality that just seemed to make time move slowly. He sighed and ran his hand through his hair. I suppose I already knew that Garp would tell me to take the position. I guess I shouldn't be hoping that he'd take the position instead since he's been refusing it since before I was in the Marines. Finally, Smoker let out a small hiss and stood abruptly, his towel casually thrown over his shoulder. It would have come as a shock, but after a week on a ship, Izuku completely understood why the Marines were borderline shameless. You two need to scrub faster. Kazan flipped water at Smoker and glared at the more normal-sized man, though really his sense of normal was more or less completely screwed. What happens if he finds a 10-foot-tall girl that likes him? That wouldn't happen. He had a quirk in this world and was going to learn super awesome marine fu. It could happen. Weirder things had happened since he got here. Like getting adopted. And meeting someone as important as Sengoku. Not all of us can just turn to smoke to clean, Kazan muttered. Things still stick to me when I turn to ice. Devil fruits. I didn't, you're just slow. I like to relax. You're always relaxed. Smoker took a long drag of his cigar that was somehow still in his mouth and then looked towards Izuku. Izuku, was it? Yes, sir. You should join us. It was less suggestion, more order. Good call, we can use someone to fetch the booze. Kazan stretched, his body giving several loud pops. Oh great, more people putting him to work. Still, maybe relaxing in the bath with them wouldn't be so bad. He followed Kazan and Smoker to one of the higher areas of the baths, one that was close to what looked like a bar that was built into the wall. The large tub was a deep mineral green and the steam that rose from it looked so inviting. After a trip to the bar, Kazan and Smoker sat in the water, sake cups at the ready while their booze floated on a small tub on the water's surface. The first step into the water took Izuku by surprise. He had forgotten what warm water actually felt like. The way the heat completely enveloped his body and then penetrated deep made him feel like all the strong work he had done since entering this world just washed away, finally allowing his muscles and bones a chance to heal and rest. It felt so good, like he could just float away and, whoa there, Kazan's sinewy hand grabbed Izuku's shoulder and pulled him to about sissy height in the water. You need to watch yourself in the bath, kid. Smoker let out a chuckle, causing the still lit butt of his cigar to flare slightly. Never seen anyone just let the water take them like that. Izuku felt his face burn. They were right, he had felt the water's energy-sapping properties, but the heat of the bath had completely washed all of that away and had turned what should have been danger into an alluring embrace. Sorry, I've been wanting to take a bath for a long time now. Kazan and Smoker both nodded and took a small sip of their sake. So, you're the kid I've been hearing about? Smoker asked. The one with the amazing devil fruit power? Amazing! Controlling the winds? Kazan drawled, his eyes meeting Izuku's and holding that gaze. There's a rush to make it a secret that only a handful of people will know about. But the rookies on your ship, well, they aren't exactly the best secret keepers. Why would they? Izuku opened his mouth to speak and felt his brain surge past the weariness and then reached the answer. For my own protection. Smoker nodded and held up his finger, causing a trail of smoke to flow from it and form a hand that grabbed the floating tray of booze and pulled it closer. It doesn't take much to figure out how impactful controlling the winds can be, especially if half the stuff those rookies are saying were true. Like what? Well, Kazan grabbed the bottle before Smoker could and filled his own cup, quickly earning a glare from Smoker. They said you made a hurricane and sank an entire fleet of New World pirates? I didn't. I stopped one ship. Izuku looked at his hand. It felt like right now he could barely manage a gust. And that nearly made me pass out. Kazan shrugged. Marine recruits love to exaggerate. Strong to tell what is and isn't when we're dealing with Garp though. Smoker sighed and rolled his shoulders. I also heard that you came flying to their ship being chased by two of the biggest sea kings they've ever seen. Izuku pulled his entire arm out of the water and traced the scars for a moment. They weren't the angry red belts that he had aboard the ship, but they were still there and apparent at even a glance. Maybe he should get some tattoos to cover them up. That part's actually true. I had to tie myself to an old sail to escape the island. It was dumb luck that Garp found me. Maybe not. Kazan mumbled. Still, that's some fruit you got there. Izuku stared at his reflection in the water for a moment. I'll make sure I use it to save as many people as I can. Once again, Izuku was greeted by something familiar to him. This exact event had happened countless times before in his old life. But, for whatever reason, even if they were still doing it at him, their laughter didn't sting. It was just like Garp's laugh back in the brig. They weren't laughing because they thought he couldn't do it. No, it was something else, like what he said just resonated with something deep inside them. After a moment, the two veteran Marines stopped their laughter and let out a long sigh. Thank you, Izuku. Kazan placed a hand on Izuku's shoulder even though it stung like ice in the heat of the bath. It's been a while since I've talked to someone so genuine. Smoker nodded in acknowledgement. You're welcome. Izuku asked with a shrug. A cup of sake was moved into his hands. The clear liquid had a hearty aroma that wasn't as repulsive as he thought it would have been. If anything, it smelled sweet. But Shush, Kazan said with a wink. I've made up my mind, so we're going to celebrate? You mean? Smoker asked. Kazan took a long sip of sake and then nodded. Yeah, I'll be accepting the position. The sake burned when it went down. If there was a natural limit for humans in this world, it must have been beaten into SBMSN by people like Garp, where it was promptly used as a jump rope, or in Garp's case, dental floss. And right now, Izuku was starting to feel the exact same way about what he had believed were human limits. In his old world, he had been quirkless, nearly a nobody, but then in this world he had gotten a quirk of his own, a devil fruit that allowed him to create and control the wind. But now, he was starting to realize that that didn't mean SHT. Izuku clutched his stomach and covered his mouth as the violent impact sent his body into shock. He stumbled back, even the closeness of the deck seemed to blur around him. His ears rung violently. The spot where Garp had hit him, or rather all the spots, seemed to hurt far deeper and far more than they should. Oh, come on, that was barely a love tap. Don't tell me those PUDs at Marineford made you weaker. Garp bellowed, a bag of chips in one hand. No, Izuku spat out as he stumbled to his feet. They had only spent a week or two in Marineford. During that time Izuku had more or less been forced to train with people that could eat him alive. From captains and up, it seemed like everyone wanted to see what the kid calling himself Garp's son could do. The answer was generally to get his butt kicked, as marine training was rough, especially training in the Rokushiki style. Normally, there would be some background in martial arts that became the foundation for expanding upon the Rokushiki style. Even brawlers like Garp had some early grasp that made learning the style ever so slightly less painful and deadly. In Izuku's case, he was literally starting with nothing, which meant that the growing pains were completely and utterly killer. Most days it felt like some part of his body was ready to fall off. Izuku winced, feeling his head P&D as he tuned into the sea around him using the wind to stabilize his senses. When they had set sail from Marineford with barely any crew, Garp and to a lesser extent had told Izuku that by the time they got back to Marineford, he'd be a fully fledged Marine. Apparently that meant learning how to sail a ship, learning to fight, and basically just trying to survive on the ship with Garp on board. The east blew, much like the Grand Line and Calm Belt felt different. The wind here was warmer, like a summer breeze, and it was so easy to feel where it was going. Izuku shook his head and put his guard up again. You're just a lot stronger than them. Garp didn't even acknowledge that and casually picked a booger from his nose before flicking it out to sea. Well, now I'm bored picking on you. Maybe we should find some pirates to throw you at. Maybe then I'll be able to see if you've improved. Izuku just gave a soft smile as he let his arms drop. He could already feel the bruises forming. At least they were kind of healing faster now. As little sense as that was making. I guess I can't just He held up a finger and spun it, creating a visible current of air in his hand. Sink them? Bah, Garp grunted. That devil fruit of yours is fancy, but don't go thinking it'll solve everything. I don't. Well, he kind of did. If there was one nice thing that everyone said about him was that his devil fruit power was going to be incredibly powerful. It was part of the reason why he was trying so strong. He never had so many people have such high expectations from him. It's just the only thing I can really contribute. And I heard that most of the pirates in the East Blue are weak, which is why there's so many marine recruits in here and, bah. Garp grunted. People that say that don't know what the hell they're talking about. I'm from here. Roger was here. Plenty of strong pirates come out of the East Blue. But should you really be boasting about strong pirates like that? Just shows that this place isn't as timid as people say it is. Garp grunted and then looked up towards the sky. I'll make sure that there's plenty of marine heroes that come out of the East Blue too. You're talking about Ace and Luffy, right? Izuku asked. He'd actually barely gathered anything on his two supposed brothers/nephews. Family relationships were murky with Garp. He didn't even know if they were actually related to Garp, or if there was even a woman crazy enough to get with Garp in the first place. Yeah, Garp took a handful of chips and shoved them into his mouth and munched loudly, the scowl on his face deepening by the moment. Those two dumbasses keep talking about how they're going to be pirates. But this time, there's no way I'm letting Ace off the hook. I'm going to take him back to Marineford and then both of you are going to be great Marines. Izuku kind of expected a laugh from Garp. Instead, he just glared in the direction they were heading. Can you tell me about them? I'm going to meet them, right? Izuku asked. They were technically family. Well, you're smarter than them. Garp grumbled, emptying the bag into his mouth. Combined, probably twice as smart. Maybe even 4 times as smart. F it, let's play it safe and say you're 8 times as smart, but don't let that go to your head. I'm pretty sure both of them could kick your butt. What kind of monsters were these kids? Ace should be about your age, maybe a year younger and about your height. He's as stubborn as they come. And Luffy? He's an idiot. Garp didn't even flinch when he said that. An absolute moron. He's even more set on being a pirate than Ace. He's probably a few years younger than you and Ace are, but it's strong to tell since he went and ate a fruit. Luffy has a fruit too. Yeah, he's made of RBB now. Garp growled. I have no idea if he'll ever grow again, but whatever. Izuku blinked slowly. So far, the only praise that Garp had offered his other children was that they were good fighters. Which was probably high praise, but still. Anyways, Garp waved his hand and turned towards the interior of the ship. See about speeding us up. I want to get to Dawn Island by tomorrow. Yes, sir. Dawn Island was somehow more boring than Izuku would have expected. Then again, the only land masses he had really seen was the island he arrived on, Marineford, and a few unnamed islands that they have passed on the journey. But still he was expecting something more than rolling hills and a few windmills near the coast. It looked comfy though. Take the ship to Gao, Garp grunted as he adjusted the hem of his button-up floral shirt, marking the first time Izuku had seen him in anything less than a suit. The look didn't suit Garp at all, not that he didn't deserve a chance to relax, but more than the shirt was way too tight on him to be comfortable, and his shorts were way too small. Then again, at Garp's size, finding clothes that weren't tailored might be difficult. The rest of the crew all nodded and continued their duties as Izuku stared at the small village where apparently Ace and Luffy lived. Izuku sat, dressed in a simple t-shirt, on the small boat that him and Garp would be taking over to the village, and wondered how long he'd actually be there for. Judging by how large Garp's briefcase was, at least a week or 2. Have fun, Bogard waved them off. I'll make sure to handle the, yeah, Garp waved him off. He kicked the side of the ship as he stepped onto the boat, causing the rope connected to it to snap. Izuku clutched onto his bag as strong as he could as the boat fell several feet into the ocean where the cool water slapped him in the face and caused his shirt to cling to him slightly. Get going, you're going to scare away the fish? Garp yelled, kicking their ship again, though it only served to rock their dingy more and push them towards the docks. Izuku smiled. It was kind of neat seeing Garp go into full grandpa mode like this, but beyond that he was also excited for what was to come. He didn't remember any brothers from his old world, he barely remembered his mother, but there was something about the idea of family that excited him. The trip to the shore was as quick as it was silent, with Garp rowing and becoming more and more frustrated. Izuku asked. Garp gave a great big growl. What? Is something wrong? Nope. Garp said with a deep frown. But I have a feeling something is going to piss me off in a couple of minutes. They got to the docks and Izuku was tasked with securing their dinghy, while Garp went off to talk to a very pretty green-haired woman that was standing at the end of the dock. Securing the dinghy was somewhat difficult, namely because Izuku had no idea what was the correct kind of knot for it. Sailing was all about knots, knots for the sails, knots for the anchor, knots for the knots and knots for those knots. It was an endless CYCL of knots. And Izuku had no idea what was what. His mind defaulted to tying everything with bunny ears, or bunny ear, since he could never quite get 2 ears on his knots. He tied it tightly, then tugged and watched it come undone. Izuku sighed and started again. Ace did what? The small wooden dock shook as Garp charged along it and rushed past Izuku, undoing the knot he had been struggling with for the past couple minutes and nearly knocking him into the water below. To say Garp looked pissed was to say that the ocean was blue. For a moment, Izuku thought that Garp was going to keep going, half expecting him to start running on the water as the ocean decided that getting in Garp's way would be less work than breaking the laws of physics to allow the 10-foot-tall man to simply run on top of it. Garp came to a dead stop at the edge of the dock and took in a deep breath. Garp's voice was loud enough that the waves briefly turned back. "You little effigy, get back here, you punk!" The entire world was silent as Garp stood on the edge of the dock taking in several deep breaths as he glared off at the horizon. It was only when the waves resumed their usual business did the world finally take a breath. Garp took in a small breath and composed himself, adjusting his shirt and rolling his neck before he turned around with a great big smile on his face. "Oh well, I'll just have to catch him. Wah." He took a few steps and then stared at Izuku for a few moments. Oh yeah. Why did it just feel like Garp had just remembered that he existed? The large man kneeled down and grabbed the rope, and in a simple flick of the wrist, tied a knot that was so perfect Izuku didn't even know how to undo it. Your punk of a little brother went off and decided to become a pirate. So, I'm going to trust you to bring him in one day. Garp rubbed his head and then nodded, either completely unaware of the burden he had just placed on Izuku, or simply not caring. Izuku was willing to bet the answer was both. But, still he couldn't understand it. But, why would someone choose to be a pirate? Weren't there better options? Why not join the Marines? Why not do literally anything else? Pirates were slavers, murderers, and they didn't have any regard for anyone but themselves. They were villains, bad guys, evildoers. So what? Izuku followed Garp to the end of the docks where that green-haired woman was standing, her hair pulled back by an orange bandana. She looked all kinds of warm and happy. "Where's Luffy?" Garp rolled his shoulders and looked at the woman with a kind smile on his face. "Up the mountain." "Oh," the woman tapped her chin. I actually think he's in town, though when he saw the marine ship, he probably ran back up the mountain." "He would." Garp shrugged and then rolled up his short sleeves and began to roll his shoulders. "Luffy was going to get punched, wasn't he? I'll go find him. Wait here." "Go easy on him." The woman laughed as Garp began to walk down the street. "Now then." The woman turned towards Izuku and a deep, primal fear appeared inside of him as he remembered a very important detail about himself. He couldn't talk to women. Well, sure, he could talk to Asuka, but that was mostly because he had to talk to her and they were friends. But this woman was older than him, really pretty, and probably one era away from making him fall over. "Who might you be?" "Oh, Izuku looked at the back of Garp. He was still rolling his shoulder like he was winding up the mother of all punches. "I'm Izuku, Izuku the monkey. Garpa adopted me and recruited me into the Marines." "He did." The woman gave a great big smile. "Then I guess that makes you Luffy and Ace's brother." "Uncle." She gave a small laugh to herself. "It's so strong to tell with them. But anyways, I'm Makino. I run the bar here in Fusha Village." "It's nice to meet you, Izuku." He gave a polite bow. "It's nice to meet you too, ma'am." "Oh my, you're certainly more polite than Luffy and Ace." Her laugh was teasing. "Well then, why don't we head to the bar? We can get you something to eat and you can tell me about yourself." His stomach answered for him. Both he and Garp had skipped the morning mess with the other Marines, fully intent on stuffing themselves with some actual food, at least compared to the onboard slop that was prepared for them on the ship. The foods at the Marine bases were normally okay, but on ships, there was something lacking. That sounds great. Right then, follow me, Mr. Marine. She was teasing him, wasn't she? Did he just get a big sister? Izuku followed her through the short village and saw several of the villagers were waving at Makino, or grumbling about Garp showing up and raising hell again. At least most of the people here looked like they were normal-sized. Maybe there was something in the Marines' food that made people randomly grow giant. Then again, Garp, Sengoku, and Akoiji were all really tall and they were all super powerful. Smoker was too, but he was normal-sized. Why were all the strong people so giant? If he got stronger, would he grow that big? Izuku took a quick step to catch up to Makino. She glanced at him with a slight hum. Do you know Ace and Luffy well? Of course. She had a great big smile on her face. Those two are like brothers to me, though there was a time when Ace said that after he became a great pirate he'd come to marry me. She gave a small chuckle. Though, I'm not sure how long I'm willing to wait for him. That's, actually what I wanted to know about. Izuku half muttered. That was one more and he'd die right then and there. Are you after my hand in marriage too? What? No, I just wanted to know why. Izuku felt his cheeks burn. Why did Ace become a pirate? Why does Luffy want to? Makino laughed. Well now, that's quite a question. Stopped in front of a wooden building with a sign hanging in front of the door. Makino opened the door and stepped to the side. Because of Garp, it wasn't his first time in a bar, but it was still a bit foreign to him, namely as he looked around at the numerous villagers that greeted Makino instantly. They looked at him with curiosity. I guess since you're a Marine, you really wouldn't understand, would you? Makino smiled as she walked around the bar. She all but spun through there, and before long, Izuku found himself sitting at the end with an amazing meal with plenty of meat being placed in front of him. You looked a bit skinny, but then again, if you're anything like the rest of those monkeys, this should be a decent snack for you. Any shame Izuku had once had from his increasing appetite was completely destroyed when he got a whiff of Makino's cooking. Somehow, the food just kind of got teleported into his stomach. So, why did you want to be a Marine? Makino leaned on the bar, propping her head up with one hand while the other drummed against the tabletop. Since you want to know why your brothers want to be pirates? What? Nearly every person in the bar turned to look at him with wide eyes. Brother? Adopted? Izuku raised his hand, which was holding a bone that still had a lot of meat on it. I've never met them, sorry. And I didn't really want to be a Marine. Izuku admitted. I wanted to be a hero, someone that saves people. Once again, that response got chuckles from a few people. Did heroes mean something else? And being a Marine means I can help a lot of people? Makino's smile remained, but the drumming of her fingers stopped. Well, I think that's a lovely goal. Izuku blinked and stared at his food, unable to meet her eyes for a few moments. Am I missing something? I think, Makino pushed off the countertop and then stretched, that you should ask Garp or Luffy these questions. I've only ever served pirates beer, or I suppose in Ace's case, been an older sister to them. But, I hope you're able to save a lot of people, Izuku. For some reason, the food didn't taste quite so good. A voice screamed through the village. Grandpa, what are you doing here? That was Luffy, wasn't it? Makino just smiled and nodded. Izuku grabbed another piece of the food and slid off the stool. I should go and make sure Garp doesn't hurt him too much. Izuku followed the sound of Garp's punches and Luffy's screams well into the woods, his head still spinning around what had happened in such a short amount of time. The Marines were the good guys, right? Everyone he had met so far had seemed nice. Sure, for an organization that size there were bound to be a few bad people. Even back in Japan there were a few heroes that weren't pure, but overall heroes were, well, heroes. Why did Ace want to be a pirate? Why did Luffy want to become a pirate too? Grandpa. Luffy's presumed voice once again echoed throughout the forest, and Izuku found himself staring at a boy. He was a bit smaller than Izuku, though his head was huge, and he was lanky as hell. For half a second, Izuku thought that Garp had not simply broken Luffy's arm, but had instead completely destroyed every single bone in Luffy's arm and was attempting to pull the skin off, stretching it beyond its limits. Then Luffy's arm snapped forward, like it was made of RBB. Gum Gum Pistol? The fist shot past Garp and bounced into a tree where it wrapped around a branch. Luffy then followed his arm and slammed into the tree with enough force to knock his arm free and cause a few leaves to fall. Devil fruits. Garp was naturally laughing, clutching his sides and nearly coming to tears. Wah! If you want to be a pirate, you're going to have to do a better job than that. No fair. Luffy pulled his face out from the tree. It took a moment before it reformed from the impact, and then even long for him to untangle himself. You dodged. He didn't. Nope. Garp laughed. You just can't aim. I'll show you. Luffy grabbed his own arm and began to pull it. This is a new one I just came up with? Isn't that normal for you? Shut up. It was then that Garp stopped laughing and looked right at Izuku. Izuku did not trust the smile that appeared on his adoptive father's face. Actually, Luffy, I think I have a better match for you. Luffy raised an eyebrow and then looked towards Izuku. Who's that guy? Izuku stepped into the small clearing where Garp and Luffy had been fighting and scratched the back of his head. He never had a brother before, so he really didn't know what to do. Hi there, Luffy, This is Izuku. Garp didn't even give him the chance to reply, instead grabbing his shoulder and putting Izuku between himself and Luffy. I'm going to train him to be a pirate hunter. He's even going to catch your brother. And if you become a pirate, I'm going to sick him after you too. Oh. Garp snapped his finger. By the way, he's your brother. No way. Luffy shouted, his face beet red. He's a marine.